you try your remote there and see if it's working?
Yeah. Track, and then everybody makes their own recordings at home and sends them to the producer, and the producer puts them on.
Okay, so we're gonna get started here.
Yeah. Hours and hours of post-production.
You can yell at them.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, getting started. All right. Hi, how is everyone doing today?
Good.
Good to hear. I hope everyone can hear me online too. Yeah, so this is the third week of Political Theology ACG. We're going to be discussing this week the medieval church, the papacy, a little bit of Charlemagne, and basically this two powers, two swords theology that develops during the medieval era. So, all right, so the first part I'm just going to do a quick review of what we've talked about before. We started off, we talked about biblical passages about the foundations of government and whether civil government was legitimate. And then we talked about the early church. As you're probably aware, the early church, it started out as a small minority in the larger Roman Empire. And for the first 300 years, it was kind of this small community that was separate from the rest of the empire. And it was often persecuted. So the Christians would claim to be good citizens, that they shouldn't be persecuted, that in fact they were loyal to the emperor, that they didn't break any laws, that the only thing they didn't do was worship the emperor, worship the state gods, and they asked for religious freedom. But there was still an open question of how much could they participate in Roman society legitimately as Christians? Could they serve in the military? Could they serve in the civil government? And some early Christians answered this, no, absolutely not. It is a pagan, unjust government. We can't serve in it at all. We must be separate. Others cited people in the Old Testament like Joseph or Daniel and said, actually working in a pagan empire can be done to the glory of the God and for the common good. And so there's this tension in the early church of how this is going to play out. Then Constantine comes along, converts to Christianity as an emperor, and starts the shift towards the whole empire becoming Christian. Edict of Milan, it legalizes Christianity. Then you have the Council of Nicaea. Edict of Thessalonica in 380 is actually when Christianity becomes the official state religion of the empire. And Constantine built lots of churches. He built up church structures. He helped issue canon law and organize the church. He also called the ecumenical council. He called Council of Nicaea, and other emperors after him called the other big ecumenical councils and paid for them, paid for everyone to come together to make those decisions on big theological issues. So the emperor was very involved in the church after it became Christian. And the structure that evolved in the Christian empire was 5 patriarchs, or 5 archbishops, essentially, in Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and eventually Constantinople, who were all traced their origins back to the apostles, who all said that one of the apostles founded my bishopric diocese, and therefore I am in a direct line from the apostles. And these 5 together kind of each had their own district that they led in the empire, and then the church would come together at the councils to make big conciliar decisions. But there is an open question of who's the real head of the church. Rome claimed to be founded by Peter, and so it was always kind of regarded as the most prestigious and honored position. But was it really the head of the church? Most people didn't think so at the time. In a lot of ways, the emperor might have been the head of the church. That's a question we're going to look into more. And then Augustine's City of God, which I'm not going to talk about much. We're going to talk more about that next week. Next week, Dan's going to take us back to Augustine's City of God, since we didn't get a lot of time to talk about it last week. And then maybe I'll talk a little about Thomas Aquinas, so we're going to kind of sandwich in some of the subjects we talk about now. But City of God, as a general thing, you have the heavenly city, the church, and the earthly city of everybody else that's sinful, and yet they are in among each other right now in this temporal world. How do they interact? How do you distinguish between them? Who's in charge? That's kind of what the City of God deals with as its subjects. So, yeah. Now we're going to move ahead I'm going to do a very quick timeline of like 1,000 years of Western church history. So I'm going to try and do this in like 5 to 7 minutes. But the basic, so I'm going to talk quickly. I'm going to ask a question at the end, but try and keep it till then. The basic point is we're going to focus on just Western church, specifically the papacy, as it evolves here, just to give you a little timeline, so then when we talk about the theology, you'll understand kind of where it fits in the overall structure of what happened. So, 4076, the fall of Rome to the Ostrogoths, is kind of the traditional collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire in the East keeps continuing. And then there's a succession of different kind of dynasties and leaders across the West. The Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Byzantines come back and take over for a little while, then they get kicked out, then the Lombards come in and take over Italy, and all through this time, the papacy is actually kind of emerging into, from a position of honor in the church, now it takes on a more geopolitical kind of position. And there's various fits and starts. This doesn't happen super fast, but it takes over the defense of the city of Rome. It starts engaging in diplomacy with advancing barbarian armies. It sponsors missionary efforts all the way around the Western European area, and that involves a lot of diplomacy. So now the papacy is kind of taking on a bigger position in among kings and other leaders. In 756 is the donation of Pepin. So Pepin the Short is a Frankish king, and in exchange for the support of the Pope for his claim to the throne, he goes in and kicks out the Lombards and gives a whole bunch of territory around Rome to the Pope. This is the foundation of the Papal States. So this area around Rome answers to the Pope now as their official political leader. He is the prince and lord of these areas of the Papal States, and he will continue to rule over the Papal States for the next 1,000 years. It doesn't change until like the mid-1800s when Italy becomes a unified nation. Then on Christmas Day, 800 AD, Charlemagne is crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. So now there's a new emperor in the West, where there hadn't been before, and he's crowned by the Pope. So the Pope, this is in some ways him emerging as I get to crown the Pope, or I get to crown the emperor, I am in charge of that. But Charlemagne also maybe wanted to be crowned emperor, and Charlemagne actually has a lot more power than the Pope in this situation at the same time. So there's this kind of who's in charge question, and we're going to go into more detail on that in a minute. But after Charlemagne has this great empire across the Western European area, his grandchildren come along and it kind of collapses. And in that time, the papacy starts to go down a hill too. Now it's super wealthy because of Charlemagne's generosity, but now all those Roman nobles in the Papal States start fighting over who's going to be Pope, and it becomes kind of a bloodbath. And in the 900s, it's kind of known as the Reign of the Harlots. Basically, it's just a lot of back and forth, backbiting, and even killing each other during that time. The larger scale between like 872 and 1012, they think something like a third of popes died under suspicious circumstances. So that's pretty bad. That's kind of one of the low points of the papacy all around. But in the 1000s, there starts to be a bigger push for reform. The Holy Roman Emperor, who's now in Germany, starts working with the Pope for some reform, but it has fits and starts, and in 1054 there's the Great Schism, where the Pope of Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople mutually excommunicate each other, and they have remained split ever since. So that's where you get Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic splits in 1054. And it's a lot more complicated than that, but we're going to skip through it. But then Pope Gregory VII comes around, and he starts introducing the Gregorian reforms. But Gregory VII is not one that maybe most Protestants have heard of, but he is really one of the most important popes. His reforms in this era really start enforcing a whole bunch of things like celibacy. which had been around but had not been enforced as like a necessary thing for all priests in all of Roman Catholicism. He started enforcing that. He started fighting back against simony, which is corruption in the church, selling of church offices. And he also started asserting papal control and authority in a way that no one had ever done before, including he traveled around into France and northern Italy and different places and started interfering in a whole bunch of local affairs and saying that I should be in charge and you should refer all the judicial questions up to Rome, and taking a whole bunch of more power than the Pope had ever had before in a direct control way. And so we're going to talk more about that too. But this also provoked controversy, including the investiture controversy. Essentially, the Pope said only the Pope or other bishops can ordain bishops and can appoint them, and the Pope must approve every bishop who's appointed. And kings and emperors said, but hey, we've been actually appointing bishops all the time, and aren't we also in some way a Christian leader who should be able to do that? So this becomes a big fight that lasts 50 years. There's war over it, and it eventually ends with the Concordat of Worms in 1122, which essentially it compromises but gives more control to the Pope. So the Pope kind of wins that situation, and partly because he gets the people on his side. He actually manages to get the people to say, we want the church to be free of outside control. We want the church to be free of the control of the civil government, and he mostly succeeds, more or less. Then you have like the Crusades. The main point here is that the Pope is now powerful enough to call for crusades. He can designate enemies of the church who need to be defeated to defend other Christian realms and to take back the Holy Land. And so there's a series of crusades. You guys have all heard of the crusades during this time. And the Pope's the one calling for them and actually is able to get a huge part of European nobility to follow along with this call. And then last thing we're going to talk about is Unum Sanctam is a bull by Pope Boniface VIII, which is kind of the highest, biggest claim to papal authority ever during this era, and it's very controversial. We'll go into detail. And then there's kind of a decline of the papacy after that, even though it's hugely wealthy and powerful. Now there's the Pope moves to Avignon in France for a long time instead of in Rome, and he's under the influence of French kings. And so then a lot of other people who are not French don't trust the Pope anymore. Then there's a great papal schism where there's multiple different claimants to the papacy, one in Rome and one in Avignon for like 100 years or 50 years. And all this kind of sows the ground for the Reformation because people feel they can't trust the Pope, where before he'd been hugely powerful in the center of Christendom. All right. Any questions about all that? Okay. So.
Stephen,
Yeah.
Although
Yeah.
The western side, eastern side, they have their own kind of what patriarch exerting his authority.
Yeah, it's definitely complicated politically all around.
Yes.
I am going to stay on the western side, but there is, it's worth noting that this is only the west and not the east. That the Eastern Church has its own problems, and then there are actually like kingdoms outside of the Roman orbit who are Christian, and were Christian from the 300s and 400s, like Ethiopia, Nubia, Armenia, Georgia, and then there's Christians in the Persian Empire who spread across Asia, who never become the majority and never actually take over the government, but have to deal with foreign or pagan or Muslim or Buddhist authority over them. And so there's a lot of different ways this could play out, but this is just the way the West played out. All right?
What were the two cities again?
Rome and Constantinople, or
No, the city of God and the
city of man, or a city of the earthly city. You can translate it.
city.
Yeah.
One of them you said was full of sinners, but not the other. Was that the way they viewed it, or?
That's the way, Augustine viewed it. It's more like the city of God is, in fact, the church, and it's like the elect, the people who are going to heaven. But Dan will deal with a lot more of that next week. I'm going to punt on the ins and outs of Augustine. So the theology that evolves all through this medieval era is the two powers or two swords theology. And so this is what the Pope will assert. And here we have an image of Christ above lowering a sword to the Pope and a sword to an emperor. So there are two swords, but they both come from Christ. And we're going to get into how that works and why that is. All right? Biblical passages to keep in mind that are going to back this up. So first you have Matthew 22:21, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. There's kind of this duality when Jesus talks about Caesar versus God, two different things, but at the same time you owe something to both of them. They're both legitimate in some way. Then you have like civil authorities from God, Romans 13, we talked about that before. Then disciples with swords. These are stories that you might not remember, but at the Last Supper, Jesus tells his disciples in Luke that, I used to send you out with nothing on your back, basically, and go out, but now you're going to need to buy a cloak, buy a sword. You're going to need to, in some way, be prepared. And the disciples like, okay, well, we've got two swords right here. And Jesus says that is enough. What does he mean by this? This is a controversial statement. We're going to go into that a little more later. But then also Peter slices off the ear of the servant of the high priest when they're trying to arrest Jesus. And Jesus tells Peter to put up his sword. So those swords will be given an allegorical spin by the church. And then Peter and the keys to the kingdom, Christ tells Peter, you are a rock, or on this rock. Is he talking about Peter? Is he talking about the statement that Peter made? And you will have the keys to the kingdom, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he says that also in Matthew 18 to the disciples in general, as like the binding and loosing. And this is the question of the keys to the kingdom. What does that mean? Catholics have a very particular understanding of that. What's the Protestant understanding? I'm not going to go into that. But that's something to wonder about. Maybe Dan will go into it in the future. I'll put him on the spot there. Okay. But yeah, I think evangelicals today tend to just ignore the question, but it is a major question. And then Samuel anointing David and just kind of the Davidic kingship, that'll be important as well. So, first thing is the letter of Galatius. This is a letter from Pope Galatius to Emperor Anastasius during the Acacian Schism. I know you know all those words and what exactly they mean, but it's 494. So the Western Empire has collapsed, but there's still an empire. There's still conflicts in the church going on, and the Pope wants the emperor to kick out the Patriarch of Constantinople because he doesn't agree with the Council of Chalcedon. The main thing is the Pope is trying to get the emperor to do what he wants. Big, long block of text. But this is the main important part of this letter. So the Pope says, "For there are two, O Emperor Augustus, by which the world is principally ruled, the sacred authority of pontiffs and the royal power." So the world as a whole is ruled both by the royal power of the emperor and by pontiffs, popes, and bishops. Among which, how much heavier is the burden of priests, such that they will have to render an account to the Lord at the time of judgment, even for those very kings. For you know, O most merciful Son, that although by dignity you preside over the human race, nevertheless you devoutly bow your neck to the leaders of divine matters, and from them you await the causes of your salvation. And you recognize that in partaking of the celestial sacraments, you must be submitted to the order of religion rather than rule over it. Therefore, you know that in these matters you depend on their judgment, not willing to force them to your will. So in spiritual matters, the emperor ought to answer to bishops, priests, and pope, because those matters pertain to salvation, and those are not the things that he should be over. Furthermore, there's for if even the bishops themselves obey your laws, knowing that rule has been bestowed on you from on high, lest they seem mundane things to oppose the eminent sentence, with what passion I ask does it become you to obey those who have been assigned for the distribution of the mental mysteries. Essentially, the bishops do obey your laws. They do obey the basic laws of the empire, and so you set up all the civil laws, we will obey them. But if we do that, you have to obey us. There's this kind of mutual ability to force the other to your will, or just mutual submission, ideally, between the civil matters and the spiritual matters. So that's kind of these two powers, and yet they work together and both kind of have power over the other. And this letter will be cited all through the rest of Roman Catholic history as kind of one of the first big statements of this image of two powers, and will be foundational. But then at the end, it will note that the Pope says, and it is settled that the faithful submit their hearts to all the priests in general who pass on divine things rightly, but how much more must they submit to the prelate of that see, whom the highest divinity willed also to be preeminent above all priests, and which the piety of the universal church subsequently celebrated. He's talking about Rome. He's saying, so everyone obviously submits to priests and bishops, but everyone ought to submit to Rome above all, the single bishop who is highest and universal. So any questions about that? The basic concept makes sense here, that this image of two powers?
It's definitely not two separate spheres, is
Right.
it? They're overlapping.
Yeah, yeah. Overlapping powers who...
Big Venn
yeah.
diagram.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, Venn diagram. Yeah, that'd be a good thing to draw. But overlapping and involved with each other. Yeah. Is it back in?
So the bottom part, the
Mhm.
very last thing about the supreme power lying in Rome,
Mm-hmm.
no one balked at this. This was an accepted thing by this point.
Well, no.
It was like the line in the sand,
No,
challenge me on
yeah,
it.
it actually, this was an assertion of power that was a new step up
That's what I
at this time. And most of the other patriarchs didn't necessarily accept this. They were willing to say the Pope is the most honored among us. But the 5 patriarchs, we're all kind of equals. He's first among equals, maybe, but he's not in charge of everybody. He can't tell another patriarch to get out. But the Pope here is relying on the authority of the Council of Chalcedon, while the Emperor is trying to negotiate a theological compromise between different groups, and the Pope says, you don't have authority to do that.
I have another
Sure.
really basic question. So when you said that there were the archbishops over all the different places,
Mhm.
then you used the word Pope.
Right.
Because, I know Pope now. I don't. So were they all considered like popes then, and then
So the
became a different thing later?
Yeah, they're all bishops,
That's
and so technically they're all bishops, but they
Right.
just are bishops with a greater degree of power. The
Okay.
Pope as a term it just means father. It was just like Papa, Pope, Father, and so it just became like a title that got attached specifically to the Roman See. And for a while, the Alexandrian patriarch would call Pope sometimes as well, and that is just traditional name.
Okay.
So as one supreme bishop, Pope didn't necessarily mean that. It just meant,
All right, thank
yeah.
you.
okay.
I
So it's,
have a question.
yeah.
That letter, because it was between the Roman Archbishop and the Emperor,
Mm-hmm.
was that Archbishop at that time, because this is pre-schism, so this is
Yes.
still during the time when they were all,
Yeah.
was he really, I mean,
There was a mini
do you
schism
think
at
that
that point.
in this context of this letter, he was asserting authority over the other archbishops, or was he really just directing this letter towards the emperor and the Western
Mm.
lower bishops and
Mhm.
priests and communities in that Western arena? Because it was a communication between the Western emperor and the Western
Right.
archbishop.
So the question of it, people couldn't hear, is the Pope asserting power over
In the
the
context of
Constantinople
that letter.
in that letter?
Yeah.
it's a little ambiguous. I'm not totally sure. I think the Eastern Church would say not really, but the Western Church, with the benefit of hindsight, would say absolutely, always had that power. So it's kind of ambiguous. I do think the Pope did excommunicate the Patriarch of Constantinople, I think, at this point. But the Pope had allies on his side in doing so, and there was a real split in the church for a couple decades there over who was in charge. And then when Emperor Justinian came in charge, he said, we're going to enforce Chalcedon, and so we're going to have patriarchs in Constantinople who will enforce Chalcedon. So in that case, the emperor made sure that the patriarch agreed with him. And so, yeah, so it's a lot of political jockeying without necessarily a clear supreme person, which in retrospect, Rome will read as always being supreme. So, okay. So this popped all up at once, but that's okay. About Charlemagne. So the Pope crowned Charlemagne on Christmas Day 800. The Pope and Emperor disagree on what this means from the beginning. So the Pope had recently been captured and had escaped, and he'd gotten to Charlemagne, and Charlemagne had rescued him and sent him back with a contingent of soldiers so he could be replaced in Rome and be secure there. And then a year later, Charlemagne shows up at Christmas, and the Pope just walks up behind him and puts the crown on his head. And Charlemagne's like, what? I didn't expect this at all. But now that you've done it, it's clearly God's will. So that's how it happened, and there's a dispute. There's not clear, was it intentional or not? It's in the sources, they all say, of course, it was not intentionally sought by Charlemagne, but no one really believes that. So Charlemagne had, at this point, taken over a big empire, and he'd been wanting to become emperor, probably. And the way he and his court people described it was God had given him the victory, clearly, and therefore God wanted him to be emperor, and the Pope was really just recognizing this fact. God had appointed him emperor, and the Pope acknowledged it to the world. The Pope and his chroniclers described it as Charlemagne did good turn to the Pope, and the Pope appealed to Peter, and Peter directly intervened with God, and God then made Charlemagne the Pope. So it was all the Pope and Peter, and because Charlemagne helped the Pope, that then he became emperor. So there's a very different who's really in charge in those two different little stories. Charlemagne's view here, another block of text, but here's he describing talking to the Pope. He says, it is our function, to the extent that divine goodness aids us, externally to defend Christ's holy church on every side by force of arms against the incursions of pagans and the devastations of infidels, and internally to strengthen it in knowledge of the Catholic faith. It is yours, most holy Father, to aid our struggle with hands raised to God, like Moses, to the end that with you interceding and God guiding and granting, the Christian people should at all times and in all places enjoy victory over the enemies of its holy names, and the name of our Lord Jesus Christ be glorified throughout the whole world. So Charlemagne is a devout Christian, if that's not clear. He really does support and reform the church throughout his realm. But he clearly sees himself as the supreme head of the church. He's the head of the church and state. It's all united in one person in Charlemagne. And he kind of sees it in the way of, think Old Testament with David, Davidic kingship. So before you had judges, you have the priests, the Levites, and you have prophets who are appointed by God directly. But then Samuel anoints David, well, first Saul, but David, and David really is kind of the head of the Israelite people, and he leads the people in worship with God, and he brings back the ark and reforms things, and he's really, there's a covenant of God with David. He's really kind of the head of all of God's people. And then the priests do like regular worship and sacrifice and things like that. And there may be a role for a prophet to come and correct him, but he's still the head. That's the way Charlemagne and a lot of kings and emperors after him will see their role in the church, in the West, and in society. Any questions about that? I might mention a couple other things, but question about that first.
Their role in society.
Yeah. Yep. So, other thing to just to mention would be that both bishops and kings at this point are appointed through ritual. There's a passing on of either the rod of authority or the staff to the bishop, of like a staff for shepherds to represent their office. And like the legal records of all these things is just a record of the ritual. The ritual is what actually confers the office, not the law. So everything is very ritualistic. There's a lot of ideas of kind of the mystical aspects of kingship, the mystical aspects of the body of believers. I'm not going to go into all that, but that it's actually really dense and fascinating. I do have a book here called The King's Two Bodies, which is a huge book, and which I've read 20 pages of. But it is, the 20 pages are really good. It's supposed to be a classic on this subject and really talking about what does it mean for a king in the Middle Ages to rule, and like the king is dead, long live the king. So the one spiritual or mystical body of the king continues on as kind of containing the whole state and all the rights of kingship, even though the king's earthly body dies. So there's a spiritual aspect going on. Again, I'm not going to go into more than right here on this aspect of kingship and stuff. I'm going to talk more about popes in a minute. But anyone more questions on that subject before we go on to talk more about that?
Through all of this,
Mm-hmm.
the parishioners in their individual churches, they don't have any say in any of what's going on here, do they? They're just the peasants doing whatever the rich and powerful tell them to do.
Probably. That's probably pretty safe to say. Yeah, the laity do not have power in the church. The king claims to have power in the church because he doesn't think he's a member of the laity.
Oh.
Yeah. So at this point, there's no separation between church and state. I don't think that terminology exists, church and state. Kings appoint bishops, and bishops had castles in the military. Charlemagne had his whole empire tithed to the church. So the church theoretically had 10% of all the GDP of the emperor at its disposal.
So
Theoretically.
political leaders are appointing religious leaders, not necessarily based on their religious fervor or their
Mhm.
ability to shepherd their flock, but based on their political motives.
Right. Right. At least somewhat, yeah. So the political motives and religious motives are all bound up together. So the separation between church and state will first start to appear in the next part here, where I'm going to talk about Gregory VII, where he asserts papal supremacy and the church should be independent because it's higher than the rest of the world here. Here's an image of Peter has the keys to the kingdom, St. Peter, and here he is giving the vestments to the Pope and the spear to Charlemagne. And this is in I believe the Lateran Palace in Rome. And so they're both being vested. They both get it from the same power. Here, not directly Christ. Here it's shown as Peter, which clearly shows that the Pope is ultimately the one in power because the Pope is directly connected with Peter, where Charlemagne is kind of secondarily connected to Peter.
But outside of the Holy Roman Empire,
Mm-hmm.
what's happening?
I think that's too big a question. I'll run out of time.
Okay.
Okay. Gregorian reform. This is a big long list. There's 27 big things that the Pope, Gregory VII, issues a bunch of dictates, and he asserts his control and then tries to back it up. Roman Church is founded by God alone. Roman Church is universal. He alone may use the imperial insignia. Of the Pope alone, all princes shall kiss his feet. They shouldn't kiss the other bishop's feet, but they should kiss his feet. Incidentally, the Pope, after he crowned Charlemagne, prostrated himself in front of Charlemagne. They ignore that in later papal chronicles. That it may be permitted to the Pope to depose emperors. He claims the right, if I can crown him, I can say you're no longer anointed by God. And that he may absolve subjects from their fealty to wicked men. If a leader, a king, an emperor has rejected the Pope, has rejected God, anything like that, then he can absolve all Christians, all the faithful, from their fealty and say, you are no longer under that authority. And so this is a major threat to all kings and emperors who reject that. They said, well, I'm appointed by God and I should have the right of authority over all my subjects. And the Pope says, if you break, if you sin, if you go against God, then I can say you're no longer in charge. So, yeah. And that's in among a bunch of other reforms that he made and ways of taking control over the church in a much more direct way.
So that gives a place like Germany more of a reason to separate itself from the Holy Roman Empire and become its own kingdom.
Yeah. Well, at this point, the Holy Roman Emperor is over Germany.
Right.
And they basically start rebelling against the Pope.
Yeah.
And this starts with the whole investiture controversy. There's a back and forth. Henry IV, Emperor, and Gregory VII, and then it. But Gregory and the other popes get the people on their side. They end up having more support than the civil leaders, and so now there's kind of a separation between the two. So I'm going to run out of time if I don't keep moving. So I'm going to keep moving. So now we get Unum Sanctum. So this is a papal bull laying it out most clearly, most thoroughly of exactly what he claims to have the authority and the biblical passages he claims this authority on. So I'm going to have a few quotes up here, but we're going to try and go through them quick and talk about the underlying biblical idea. So of the one and only church, there's one body and one head. Not two heads like a monster. That is Christ and the vicar of Christ, Peter and the successor Peter. So Christ and Peter are kind of united here. It's one head, but they're together, so they're not separate. And since the Lord, speaking to Peter himself, said, feed my sheep, meaning my sheep in general, not these, not those over there, or in particular, whence we understand that he entrusted all to him, to Peter.
Wow.
So that's kind of the universal bishop. The church has one head in heaven, who's Christ, and one body that is Christ, but the head on earth is Peter, and is the Pope, and successor to Peter. So that is the official understanding, Roman Catholic, to today. Next, we are informed by the text of the Gospels that in this church and in its power are two swords. Here's the two swords. So before it had been two powers, here's explicitly two swords. Namely, the spiritual and the temporal. Spiritual sword, temporal sword. For when the apostles say, behold, here are two swords, that is to say, in the church, since the apostles were speaking, the Lord did not reply that there are too many, but sufficient. This is a controversial passage because this is the Last Supper, and the apostles say, yep, well, we've got two swords right here, and Jesus says that's enough. What does he mean by that's enough? According to this, Jesus meant that is correct, that is sufficient, good. According to most modern Protestant theologians, it's that's enough, you didn't understand me at all. Two very different tones and understanding, but just the words that's enough. How do we understand that? But if you understand it as that is enough, that is sufficient, does that immediately mean that therefore there are two swords, a temporal and a spiritual, in the church at all times for all eternity? This is an allegorical interpretation that goes in a beyond what I feel comfortable assuming from that story. But yeah. And once you have two swords, certainly the one who denies that the temporal sword is in the power of Peter has not listened well to the word of the Lord commanding, put up thy sword into thy scabbard. So Peter slices off an ear, and Jesus says, put up the sword. Well, Peter had a sword. So he does have the sword that can be used temporally to fight and kill, but Jesus told him to put it away. So he has it in his scabbard from now on, in the spiritual allegorical sense, but he shouldn't be using it himself. So the Pope and the bishops and priests should not be engaging in warfare themselves in general. Instead, they have the civil government to do that for them. So the two swords reside in the church, but the civil government obeys the church when using the sword. And that's because the material temporal sword should always serve, the material and temporal should always serve the higher and spiritual. That's just a general principle that the medieval church thought was absolute. So yeah. The spiritual and the material sword, but the former is to be administered by the church, but the latter for the church. The former in the hands of the priest, the latter by the hands of kings and soldiers, but at the will and sufferance of the priest. So we're almost out of time here. The main point here is that just a summary of Unam Sanctum, but then at the very end, the Pope says, furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman Pontiff. And this is considered an ex cathedra statement, a statement by the Pope from the throne, and therefore is a infallible statement of defining doctrine. Which, the question is, does the rest of this, the letter also infallible, or just that last statement? A little vague, but yeah. Okay, so we got 2 minutes left. I just have a couple takeaways, questions for you guys. So is the doctrine of two swords still Roman Catholic doctrine? Kind of. Unam Sanctum, as I said, is considered ex cathedra, therefore infallible, so it cannot be renounced, but they can distance themselves from it, and it was pretty drastically modified by Vatican II, where they emphasized things like freedom of religion is something that the church should pursue for all religions, and that in the view of the common good and what's the common good in the modern world, that's not something that they're pursuing. But so there's a question of, did they actually break with their tradition here, or are they still connected to it? And so that's a big kind of open question, or controversial question at least. Question for us as we go forward in this class: so should temporal power submit to spiritual power? Does that make sense? And how is that different from Protestant two kingdoms doctrine? We'll get to that in a couple weeks. But how is this different from saying political leaders should submit to God? Seems logical. Is that the same thing as saying that political leaders should submit to the servants of God here on earth? Should the authorities in the church have authority over the authorities in the state? That's kind of a different question. And then, how's it different from saying society should be Christian? Society should serve God, right? Seems to be go in a line, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe there's some things here where it doesn't make sense. Because I think most of us react against these medieval ideas and think, well, that's not the way it should be. We're democratic American Protestants, we don't believe that. But there are ways in which the logic does have similarity. If we say that society ought to be Christian, society ought to follow God's law, then there's some similarity there. And I guess, yeah, and then of course, yeah, if civil government should serve the good of the church, what about heresy, blasphemy, etc.? Those are things that in the medieval church were clearly something that the civil government should defend the church from. Time's up. But heresy should be defined as heresy by the church, and then the civil government should deal with it. So the church wasn't generally burning heretics at the stake. The church was having the civil government burn heretics at the stake, which didn't come in until like the 1000s. In the first 1,000 years, they didn't burn heretics at the stake at all.
Kind of like Jewish leaders having the Roman Empire be the ones who
Yeah,
crucified Christ.
yeah. The Romans crucified Christ at the behest of
Yeah.
the Jewish leaders. That is a good point. Yeah.
Did the medieval church believe we live in a fallen world? I mean, they probably wouldn't have used those words.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. They definitely believed the world was fallen and sinful, but that's why we should serve the higher spiritual power, because that's the way to heaven. Yeah.
I'm just floored at the way that Rome took advantage of, the Eastern churches lost its power because of the Muslims taking over that part of the world, and how Rome just kind of summarily took advantage of that to say, okay, we're in charge of all Christians now.
Yeah.
All Christianity rests in us.
Yeah.
Wow. That floors me.
The thing is, I mean, if Rome hadn't said that, the emperor would have said that. So there is a question of one or the other is going to be in charge. Who ought it to be in those ages?
Of all Christians everywhere?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, that's definitely what the emperor claimed. Even if the emperor wasn't actually in charge of everyone, he was the representative of all Christians everywhere for the world. I guess we should, turn off the thing here, but hopefully that went well. Oh, do you know how to stop it?
I'm gonna minimize that. Oh, there it is. Bye.
End stream.